Hi, I've got a quick
Cool.
question about the hiring process.
Okay.
So so say down the road, whenever I decide to apply to the ATF for an internship or something, am I required to not know the Second Amendment, or am I trained to ignore it?
Everyone, as always, any requirements for internships or employment will be listed.
The Biden administration announcing new changes to gun rules this morning, which will soon affect thousands of private sellers of firearms.
The rule requires anyone who sells firearms predominantly to earn a profit to become federally licensed.
The Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms, and Explosives will begin enforcing this change in 30 days.
Today, the Justice Department is issuing one of the most significant gun regulations in decades. Pursuant to the Bipartisan Safer Communities Act, the regulation expands the definition of who must obtain a license and conduct a background check before selling firearms. This regulation is a historic step in the Justice Department's fight against gun violence. It will save lives. There is still so much more to do. The Justice Department will not rest until every family, every law enforcement agent, and every community is safe from the devastation of gun violence.
The administration is tightening up the definition of what it means to be engaged in the business of selling firearms. The administration says the change in the language being made by the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms is not only in accordance with the Bipartisan Safer Communities Act, but it's also more specific to better regulate the market under this new federal law. Some argue this new rule could infringe on Second Amendment rights.
You think?
Which is one reason why Whalen expects it to be challenged.
Biden will face the same among, Republican voters who might be thinking that they don't want to vote for Trump again, but gee, look, he's taking away our gun rights.
It does not, however, set a number for how many gun sales constitute crossing that line, leaving a question for who needs a license to sell and conduct background checks. President Joe Biden said in a statement, this is going to keep guns out of the hands of domestic abusers and felons. Congress needs to finish the job and pass universal background checks legislation now.
Speaking of the law, Senators Cornyn and Tillis, Republicans who worked on the Bipartisan Safer Communities Act, both say that you now have gone beyond the scope of the law, that this isn't really a Second Amendment thing. This is you're trampling on congressional intent, that the executive branch is doing something it was not given authority to do. How do you respond to that?
Well, I agree that this is certainly not a Second Amendment issue. They're right about that. Tens of thousands of federally licensed firearms dealers are out there every single day following the law and obeying the rules and able to sell guns legally with background checks. We went through the Administrative Procedure Act process in order to push this rule out. That meant that we put out a notice of the proposed rule, that we received 387,000 comments to that rule. Some were sent by many, many members of Congress. The vast majority of comments that we received supported the proposed rule, and we took into account folks who suggested improvements to the rule, and in some cases, focuses to the rule that helped it to make sure that it didn't cover people who went beyond the Bipartisan Safer Communities Act, right? This is not a universal background check law. Only Congress can do this.
The administration is tightening up the definition of what it means to be engaged in the business of selling firearms.
I know that it went through the comment process, but the executive branch grants itself authorities that it sometimes doesn't have all the time in American history. So I guess the question is, are you expecting a fight on the grounds that you overstepped the authority that Congress gave you, and what would the defense be?
Well, I don't know what to expect. Obviously, people can, if they want, litigate these things in the court.
Chris is here. He's one of our leading experts. I can't get this one apart. They could buy the aftermarket parts and simply attach that on.
and to buy those parts.
A gun owner of many different types and a 20-year military veteran. I have some expertise in weaponry and self-defense weapons. What could you, in 15 seconds, would you define an assault weapon for me?
So
if you go past 15 seconds, I'll just interrupt you.
No, so I'll go shorter than that, because I honestly, I do think that's if Congress wishes to take that up, I think Congress would have to do the work, but we would be there to provide technical assistance. Unlike you, I'm not a firearms expert to the same extent as you may be, but we have people at ATF who can talk about velocity of firearms, what damage different kinds of firearms cause.
Mr. Dettelbach, in your 2018 campaign for Attorney General, you called for a ban on so-called assault weapons. What is an assault weapon? Could you define it for me?
Senator, when I was a candidate for office, I did talk about restrictions on assault weapons. I did not define the term, and I haven't gone through the process of defining that term. That would only be for the Congress if it chose to take that up to do, and if you chose to take it up, I would be at the ATF, and there is perhaps expertise or data we could give you so that you could make the appropriate decision to both protect the public and protect the Second Amendment.
So you're running for public office and you called for a ban on assault weapons, but you don't have a definition for assault weapons?
Senator, it would only be for a legislative body, whether it was the Ohio legislature or the Congress. It would only be for a legislative body to do that work. And I acknowledge that would be a difficult task to define assault weapons, because on one hand, you don't want it to be so narrow that it doesn't offer the protections that are intended. And on the other hand, you certainly don't want it to be so broad so that it infringes unnecessarily on the rights of citizens. So I acknowledge that's a difficult task, but it would be for this body to do, not for me.
Why is it so hard to define assault weapons?
Well, I think, Senator, what I told you, which is that it is, you don't want it to be so narrow as to be meaningless, and you don't want it to be so broad as to infringe on the rights of law-abiding Americans unnecessarily. For me, it would be what elected legislators who are charged with having these discussions and debates would choose or not choose to call it.
Okay. I think it's very telling that you're nominated to lead the ATF and you don't have a definition of assault weapon, and the point is that there is really no such thing as a category of weapons known as assault weapons. There are rifles, there are shotguns, there are pistols, they have properties, they have features, but there is no such thing as a category of assault weapon.
Say down the road, whenever I decide to apply to the ATF for an internship or something, am I required to not know the Second Amendment, or am I trained to ignore it?